Welcome to the Urban Reform Podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Roldan, and today I have a guest on who had a debate about 2 days ago. Seth Bloomsburg had a debate with Jacob Brunton on classical versus presuppositional. Really didn't get much into the distinctions there, so it was more about was spoken about circular reasoning and argumentation and things like that. But I have him on today in order to discuss the details of the debate and see what his thoughts are. So with that said, I'm going to bring in Seth in. What up, Seth?
Hey, Ricky.
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty well.
All right. So as we discussed, we're here to discuss the debate and just pretty much give our thoughts on what happened, maybe clear up some things or say some stuff that you thought you wanted to say. I know when I do debates afterwards, like, I could have said this, I could have said that, I should have said this, I should have said that, I shouldn't have said this. Yeah. So
I know how that goes.
So why don't you give us just a quick brief background about yourself, man? How'd you become a Christian and into presuppositional apologetics?
Well, I've always been a Christian. I grew up in a Christian household. I'm originally from Moscow, Idaho, and I went to a place called Logos School, which is an ACCS school, from preschool to 12th grade. I graduated in 2006. It was a school that was started in part by Doug Wilson, who is a Van Tillian, and he's debated various. He was in the documentary Collision, created by Darren Doan, where he debated Christopher Hitchens, and he's written responses or debated other atheists like Eddie Tabash, who debated Greg Bonson back in the day. He's also debated Dan Barker. He's written responses to atheist screeds, like those written by Sam Harris. So he's pretty big in the Reformed debate world. And so I grew up, went to the school he founded. I eventually found my way to New St. Andrews College, which is the school that he founded. And basically how I got into apologetics was I just kind of finally realized one day that if somebody asked me, give me a reason why you believe what you believe, I really wouldn't have been able to give a good answer. And I realized this when I first started getting into college and took a kind of a religions light class, or a survey of religions class. And I was kind of doing my best to argue, but I did kind of realize I don't really know what I'm doing. And I saw a blog post by Doug at one point where he listed all of his philosophical influences. And I knew, generally speaking, which names were associated with apologetics, so I just started buying books by those guys. And he listed Cornelius Van Til, C.S. Lewis, Greg Bonson, Francis Schaeffer. So those are all names I was somewhat familiar with. And so I just bought books by them, started getting familiar with them, and also started downloading Bonson's lectures from cmfnow.com. And I actually dropped out of college in 2010. And which in one sense I couldn't wait to do, because I wanted to study all sorts of things on my own. I actually started studying a little bit on my own before I even dropped out. So two of the first books that I read on apologetics specifically were C.S. Lewis's book Miracles and Van Til's Defense of the Faith, because I had heard about Van Til, and I also heard that he was widely misinterpreted. People say he says this, but he actually says this. And so I just thought, well, I'm just going to give it a shot. I'm going to read him and interpret him on my own as best I can, because I want to make sure I get it straight from him. And then it just went from there. I've been studying apologetics for years, and I've, listened carefully to Bonson's lectures and read books that he recommended or books that he referenced in his lectures, like Bertrand Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, Quine's book, The Web of Belief, things like that.
Sounds good, brother. Sounds good. Sounds a little similar, not the whole college part, but introduced to presuppositional apologetics, getting everything I could get my hands on, Bonson lectures and videos. And I know the first thing I saw of Bonson was the debate.
Yeah.
That was Stein. That was the first video I ever seen. I heard of Bonson. I read a few articles online here and there throughout the years. Didn't really understand it. It was over my head. I was like, but when I actually saw him do it, things started clicking for me. I was like, man, I've seen it, I think 100 times since then. Just to refresh. You know, sometimes we can get caught up in, you know, how should I do it? What should I start with? Or what should I think he gives a good, pretty basic model of how to engage, you know, in apologetic discourse. Obviously, there's little, you know, antennas that go out different ways, but I think he has a basic good model there.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So, as you know, there has been controversy the last maybe year or two. I think more of a year with certain individuals who have been on some kind of hyperbolic attack mode on presuppositional apologetics and on presuppositionalists, which makes that unfortunate.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we can all disagree on stuff, but when we start, you know, attacking the people, it's like, now we're getting a little crazy.
Yeah.
So these two individuals, you know, from this new Christian intellectual website that have been attack mode on it, and they got a little following. It's not a huge following, but it's enough online of a ruckus to at least have to address it. Let's be real. I mean, I know some people will be like, why you gotta even give them the airtime, whatever. We still, even though they're, you know, being very aggressive in their attacks, I mean, we're still Christians. We still gotta deal with things in that light, you know, even though I don't, you know, believe they're doing a good job at that. And maybe some of us either, I don't know. But so finally this a debate happened, you know, not to mention, you know, Jacob Brunton refused to debate me. Just want to put that on record, on video, sir. I see you. No, but yeah, I asked him to debate the merits of presuppositional apologetics, which is what I wanted to do, you know, with him. But hey, he didn't want to. Fine, he didn't want to. I'm gonna force him to. But I'm glad he did it with you. This was Saturday. What's today? Today's Monday, so it was Saturday, right? And I think it went pretty well, pretty good. I believe you did a good job at explaining the presuppositional principles. I mean, it didn't get into every detail, but I think I could see he kept trying to shift the focus to what he wanted to talk about, which was, you know, the whole point about extra circular arguments, whatever that means, circular reasoning, and the whole ontology and epistemology. And this one point he was very animate on, which I want to see if you can explain that for us who maybe never even heard of that. But before I get into that, what do you think about it? You know, what stood out to you in this debate?
Well, I think I didn't honestly think it went as well as my debate with Cody, my personal opinion. I think with Cody, I actually kind of ran out of stuff to do with cross-exam. Because I pretty much got him where I wanted him. And
which I must say, I have not seen that yet. I just actually heard about it. So I want to check that one out.
Yeah, so I thought one of the things that I think tangled us up in the second debate, the one that I had with Jacob, was there were a lot of avenues to go down, and we only kind of touched on a lot of them. Like, for example, when I tried to go after the cosmological argument, I think I could have done a better job of pressing it. You know, I really wanted to get him on the, you know, supernatural causation versus natural causation distinction. And I think I went after that pretty well, but there are other aspects of the criticisms of that argument that I think I could have done better going after, but part of it is just time constraint. You know, with right. Cody, for me, it was pretty simple to go after some of the points he was trying to make. But there were just so many different avenues that we could have gone down with theistic arguments with Jacob that I felt I kind of ran out of time, actually, which is odd to say because it was a 2.5 hour debate.
Right. You were limited in what you were able to do in a certain time frame and stage of the debate.
Yeah, and then part of the constraint is just, you know, a human one. I can only concentrate on so many things at once. So when he tried to make his point about an extra-circular standard to verify a worldview, I think I did a good job of making the point that those don't exist. But I think I could have turned it around on him better and made the point that, like, well, if you want to say that your extra-circular standard, you know, he says the twin verification principles of, you know, sense perception and logic, I could have gone after him, I think, a little bit better and said, well, actually, that's your own worldview. It's not, you can call it an extra-circular standard, but it's its own circle.
Right. And it's a standard by which he's starting with self.
Yeah.
Reason.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think Brunton was actually really good. I don't remember which lecture it was, but there was some lecture where he talked about how if you're going to evaluate one worldview versus another, there's no neutral space. There's no where you can evaluate it from. You're always going, if you evaluate it at all, there's always some worldview by which you're evaluating those two other worldviews. So it's one of those things where we really have to do a good job of driving the point home that worldviews are inescapable. Right. And there's no neutrality. It's not a matter of whether, but of which.
Right. You know, I guess in my opinion, when I was watching you ask him about his view, his cosmological view, argument, and when you was repeating it back to him, I saw him struggling with that, with your refutation of his. It's like he was kind of just repeating what he was already saying. In other words, he wasn't really answering your question.
That's one part of the debate where I think I really did have him cornered. You know, especially when I was talking to him about, you know, he said when I talked to him about how all of his premises had to do with natural causation, but he had a supernaturalistic conclusion, and he was just like, well, why would I need to prove that? Like, what's the difference? And I'm like, well, the difference is between God and God's creation. That's what the supernatural natural distinction is. Right.
That's ironic. Which is ironic because he wanted to make that distinction between a general natural revelation and a special revelation. Yeah. So, well,
there were various points where I think I kind of touched on it, where he said that, well, you have to believe in logic and sense perception, otherwise you can't prove anything. And I was like, well, that's true, but he's again engaging in a kind of circular reasoning without being willing to call it that.
Well, he was he was using a transcendental argument. I mean, he said it clear. He was like, that without logic and reason, you couldn't prove anything. You know, we're starting with it. So, well, that's kind of what Kant and them said. So, I found that pretty ironic too.
Yeah, it was. And it's one of those things where I have found that even people who say that they don't use transcendental arguments or say they don't understand them, they still end up using them without really calling them that. I mean, the way Jacob formulated his argument for the laws of logic pretty much goes back to Aristotle. I think that's the way Aristotle formulated his discussion of the laws of logic, where, well, they have to be true because if you affirm them, well, then you're affirming them. And if you deny them, then you're still affirming them because you distinguishing between denying them and affirming them. So you can't escape. But the question for me is, okay, what's the more basic, like, I understand that you can't not use them. You know, I get that. But what worldview do you have to adopt in which it makes sense to use them? And that's the more basic question that he wasn't really willing to answer.
Right, and that's a common objection that a lot of these guys make, and we continue to belabor the point that we're not against logic or against reason like they claim. What we're saying is that the transcendental argument emphasizes their need even more than even they do. The fact that we do use logic, we do use reason, and that's inescapable. As humans, we have to and we make that distinction, which he called weird. You know, I don't know if you believe that a little weird distinction between proximate and ultimate. It's not weird. It's a vital distinction. It's part of Christian philosophy that you know, especially where Van Til and Bonson highlighted this distinction. That sure, we start with our proximate, you know, starting point is our self, logic, reason, senses. We call it our proximate starting point. We can call it our immediate starting point, local, temporal, however you want to put it. The fact is, we don't deny that. What we're saying is because of that. What we're saying is, but we don't stop there. We don't stop with us, because that becomes, like we said, it's circular, but it's a vicious and fallacious circular, because we're not all knowing. We can't ultimately justify our logic and reason by just merely our logic and reason. Our question is, what is your ultimate justification for your logic and reason? That's the proximate ultimate distinction. And we say, of course, that the God of Scripture, the ontological Trinity, is the ultimate justification for not just the reality and the ontological necessity of logic and reason, that he created them, knowledge, or it has given us knowledge. But, and I don't want to confuse people, I'm not saying God created logic. What I'm saying is he has given us the ability as created beings to be logical and attain knowledge, but also that we know what we know, and we know that our reasoning and logic is generally reliable and valid because God says it is. So we have that ultimate justification for the fact that we can locally start with self. And I think that's a distinction they either want to ignore. They might get it and they go, oh, that's too strong of a point. I'm just going to keep pretending I don't understand it, or I reject it. It's weird, some weird little distinction, you know. But I think you pretty much explained that to some degree to him. Like, he didn't even touch that. He didn't even deal with it throughout the debate.
Yeah, I was able to watch part of your response to him. I didn't get through all of it, but yeah, that's one of the first things that you mentioned was the proximate starting point versus ultimate starting point distinction. And honestly, the more I get into this debate, the more I think about how crucial that distinction is, because not distinguishing those two causes just all sorts of confusion. There was actually a friend of mine who just did an undergraduate thesis on Van Til and had some criticisms of it. And his main criticisms was, well, you know, Van Til says that we shouldn't use autonomous reason. Well, of course, everyone uses reason. And the proximate versus ultimate starting point distinction is exactly what solves that problem. We're not saying don't use reason. We're not saying don't use your local starting point for knowledge. What we're saying is autonomous reason isn't referring to that. When we say autonomous reason, what we're talking about is the ultimate justification for it. Autonomous reason doesn't say don't use the local starting point. It's saying don't use the wrong ultimate starting point.
Right. And it's saying, hey, God is saying, God, I am the ultimate justification for those tools that you are using. Not because I am ontologically necessary, but I'm also epistemically necessary. You know what you know, okay? Because I have told you. I told you that you can know what you know. You can have true knowledge. You can have truth. You can, have certainty in what you believe. Of course, not on everything, but in the most important things of Scripture and God's existence and our salvation and things like that.
Yeah.
Like Christ, it boggles my mind sometimes when people say that, like, oh no, we can't be sure of anything. Even Christians, we can't be sure of anything. Okay,
yeah, I remember seeing
that. Like, really? Are you sure that Jesus Christ died on the cross? I mean, let's just get to the nitty gritty,
Yeah.
Did he resurrect? And I'm 99.9% sure. So there's a percentage that he didn't? Come on. That doesn't make any sense.
I remember watching a debate by William Lane Craig, and I think there are times when he has good points apologetically, but I remember him saying, he was being asked by somebody, well, are you absolutely certain that you're correct? And his immediate answer was, no, of course I'm not absolutely certain I'm correct. And it's just like, yikes.
It's an absurd concept to have certainty.
Yeah.
And now people try to defend it. Well, what he meant was, no, I've watched the whole thing. I know what he meant. So anyways. So that's an important distinction that he was missing. The whole proximate, because to him it's weird, but for us it's vital. It's a biblical distinction, and it's that creator creature distinction that's basic to Christian theology and Reformed theology, and because Van Til said it, people want to reject it. Van Til said it, that's been, maybe terms weren't used like that all the time, but there's a creator distinction. I mean, we see that even in the theology proper when we're talking about God's attributes, right?
Yeah.
That God has communicable attributes and incommunicable attributes. Well, why? Because there's a creator-creature distinction, that he has made it to where he shares some of his attributes with us. Thinking, creating, loving, using our reason, being logical, all those things. Obviously, we're not omnipresent. We're not omniscient. We're not infinite. Things like that. Those are some of the types of attributes he doesn't communicate with man, with his creation. So it's an important distinction to understand. It's a creator-creature distinction. Which I think, and it's when I read this stuff from these guys, and I don't want to judge too harshly, but sometimes, well, most of the time, I'm like, it seems to me that they're off on this because their theology is off. There's certain things that they're not getting in theologically that's not allowing them to understand really what we're saying.
Yeah, and I honestly think
important,
Yeah, I honestly think that was a problem with Sproul too. Before my debate with Cody, I decided I didn't quite finish it by the time the debate showed up, but I read through Sproul's book, Classical Apologetics, and I think one of the best ways to learn your own theology better is to read people who disagree with it and don't like it and think it's bad, because there are, and I honestly think one takeaway from this debate would be for presuppositionalists to just do a better job of doing our own homework. We can't just read Bahnsen and Frame and Van Til and call it good. I think we really do need to engage with the way other Christians do apologetics, like Sproul or Walter Storff or Plantinga, because it will challenge you to really think about what you believe and show you maybe inconsistencies in your thinking or things that you haven't really considered. So I read through some of what Sproul was saying, and it does seem like there's a disconnect with some of the theology, first of all having to do with total depravity, where they don't seem to think that depravity is total. Like your reason it's almost like a Roman Catholic kind of viewpoint where your reason is unaffected. by sin,
Right.
but everything else is. And they wouldn't say that. They would say, well, of course your reason's affected, because they never draw the conclusion that God exists. Well, your reason isn't just affected in the conclusion, it's affected in what you consider your starting point to be, what you believe your methods and principles of reasoning are, what they are and what their scope is and what they can do. The more I've studied atheist philosophers, the more it has become just abundantly clear that, they really do, whether they realize it or not, they start off disbelieving in presupposing that God doesn't exist. This came out really clearly in Anthony Flew is an atheist philosopher, or he converted before he died, but he was mentioned in one of Bahnsen's lectures, so I chased down the book that Bahnsen quoted, and I think it's just called God and Philosophy. And at the time, he was an atheist, and it was you couldn't come up with a clear statement of total depravity, and it's not just there's not enough evidence for atheists, it's that they presuppose he can't exist. At the very end of the book, Anthony Flew says, he talks about what conditions there would have to be in order for God to exist, and he specifically and clearly says the only kind of God, yes, I think God could exist, but the only kind of God that I think could possibly exist is a God who's immanent to creation, who's an extension of reality. So there's your statement right there, that he says he presupposes that a transcendent God cannot exist. And of course, he doesn't give a reason for thinking that. But of course, the reason is he's totally depraved, his conscience is seared, and he does not want to admit that a God like that could exist. So reason doesn't just affect the conclusion, it affects the reasoning process and the starting point. And I think that's the theological aspect of classical apologetics, that they get it wrong, and that's why it affects their the way they do apologetics.
Right, and it's not a coincidence in that Flew became a deist, actually.
Yeah,
He
because
became a theist, but it was deism based on, I didn't know that, what you said about what he said in the book, but now that makes sense why he became a deist. He's, a God that's, out there, and he didn't want to admit of a God that's not only transcendent but immanent.
Yeah. Well, I actually heard that he became Catholic, I think, which would kind of still make sense, because they have basically an Aristotelian version of God.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I'd have to look. I don't remember which one. I thought he became Catholic, but
unless I'm confusing him with another atheist that became. I think it was him. Real old guy, right? Like super
I think
old.
so. I think he died when he was like in his 80s, and he died late in the 20th century. I'd have to check. It's been a while. It's been a couple of years since I read the book. So. Yeah.
So what I say is what I used to do as a classical Ligonier guy.
Mm-hmm.
I was very John Gerstner, R.C. Sproul. I read the classical apologetics books years ago, and they mentioned Presup. They had a whole section on the critique, and I was like, ooh, that's I never heard it until I read, and when I read it from their perspective, I'm like, ooh, that's garbage.
Yeah.
How can that even be Christian? Because I didn't understand it. So I can see why, even though we belabor to help them and correct what they're, it's almost like they don't care what we say. Like, you guys are a bunch of goofballs, and I'm gonna go around and believe what R.C. Sproul said. He got a PhD and he's a theologian. That doesn't mean that they're automatically right on everything. Everybody has their blind spots. But I understand, especially being in the Reform camp. They're going to agree the Word of God is the ultimate and final standard, authority in all things. The Confession of Faith teaches that. Sola Scriptura, all that. They're gonna, man is depraved. Everything is touched totally. Man and his total nature, his will, his reasoning, everything is corrupt by sin. And so we're gonna agree on those points. But when it comes to actually applying that in apologetics, they tend to pull on the reins. They fall short of using those same distinctions in the apologetic realm. Do it in theology, but not in apologetics. And that's where they become inconsistent. They're inconsistent with their theology and their apologetics. And what I used to tell my youth group in the college group I used to teach is, they know, I do martial arts since I was a kid. Did, Wing Chun, Kung Fu, Jeet Kune Do, and all that stuff, Bruce Lee's style. But I would tell them this: I would go to school, this is an analogy, and I would see guys looking fresh. I mean, looking like master ninjas and Shaolin monks when they're in there doing their katas. They're looking real nice, and but when it came down to face an opponent, all that went out the window. They don't know how to apply the techniques that they are learning. They're looking all nice by themselves. That reminds me of what you were saying. We can't just learn how to do the technique, learn how to read Bonson, Van Til, and use the transcendental argument. That's it. We have to know our opponent's technique. We got to know what's coming in order to block and counter punch and things like that. Like, again, I've seen guys, they look nice in their katas and in their, movements, but when they put opponents in front of them, they look all weird. Their hands drop. They go from looking like this to like, they don't know what to do. They're scared. Like, no, it's because you've only learned how to look nice, but you haven't engaged. You have no experience in fighting. You have no experience in debating, or you haven't read either, the other view to know what are they saying about our view in order for you to fill in those holes. For you to see, well, that's not correct what you said, or okay, that's a valid argument of what you said, but this is how we resolve it. Stuff like that. And I think this is what, a lot of presuppers do that. I think you can see some people kind of struggle, and some are still learning. I get it. Some are still learning. But I see that with Reformed guys, great in theology. You hear them, boom. Their theology is on point. Their soteriology, eschatology is like, boom, yes, amen. Right? Like, but then when it comes to apologetics, you're like, ooh, oh no, don't say that. Oh, what are you talking about? What happened? It flew right out the window because they separate apologetics from everything else. Like, why? Because the whole point of being a neutral, we gotta cater to their complaints, and the atheists don't want us to start with scripture. We're, like Sproul said to Bonson in his videos critiquing precept, that we are making the question. We're starting with the very premise that we're supposed to be proving, all that stuff, But of course we know, we don't, we start with the God of Scripture. We don't conclude to him. And all that stuff, So I think that's a major issue. They may agree, but hey, the proof is in the pudding. It's for everybody to see,
slogans can be helpful. Like when Bonson talks about the only proof for the existence of God is that without God you can't prove anything. That is helpful as an image, or like a kind of a very terse way to explain what we're doing. But you have to be able to fill that out. I think at one point Frame talks about silver bullet arguments, and I think what he's talking about is this, where you can claim that you have to presuppose that God exists in order to know anything, but then you have to be able to fill it out. You have to actually talk to the person, like, what do you believe? Are you an atheist? Are you a Hindu? Are you agnostic? Like, what is it that you believe? And then you have to have enough of the practice at the methodology to show them, well, actually, if you claim that your Hinduism is true, you can't know anything, and here's why. So give people credit who are still learning about it, but I think this can be an opportunity, as frustrating as it can be to have, the new Christian intellectuals go after us and say, seemingly just totally misrepresent what we're saying. Well, it's a good opportunity for us to just kind of regiment our commitments and make sure that we're being as clear and precise as possible, because I actually think that many of the questions that they raise are perfectly legitimate ones. Like when Jacob talks about, well, is there an extra circular standard to help you judge between worldviews? Well, if I just said, well, you're using autonomous reason, that doesn't really answer the question. It's true, but it doesn't really help get the debate going anywhere. And so in the debate, I tried to say, well, you can't have an extra circular standard. The standard of coherence is within Scripture. And furthermore, even if you could have an extra circular standard, that would still be a worldview in itself. I didn't drive that second point home as well as I could have, but yeah, I mean, it is basically, it's just, practice and sanctification, be patient, don't flip out, don't tell the other person that they're just an idiot.
Right.
Even if they are being, frustrating to
idiots.
Just stay calm, and go after the argument of what they're saying. And sometimes you'll have to re-explain things to people several times. I kind of felt like I had to re-explain things to Cody. I mean, he's always seemed sincere in his questions, but it does seem like I have to explain things to him half a dozen times, and then he still goes on and misrepresents what we believe. But that's the way it goes sometimes.
Still doing it. Yeah. So going to that point about the scriptures, not only is the Bible internally consistent, which Jacob agreed with. Yeah, of course, I agree with you, but that's not just our point. And I don't think that was just your point either. It's not just that the Bible is internally consistent, but it's that the Bible, it gives us our rational, consistent justification for being able to be consistent, for those preconditions of intelligibility that we use in order to use argumentation, proof, logic, reason to come to the conclusion that the Bible is consistent. See? It justifies, not only is it consistent, it justifies our ability to be consistent. And I think that's the part he missed, because he flat out said it. He's like, ontologically God is necessary, but God is not necessary for epistemology, if you understand. Like, we don't understand epistemology because we disagree. Again, we're using Christian categories. They're still using secular philosophy categories. But we're saying all truth are God's truth. So yes, epistemically and locally, we start with ourselves. But once we, as Bonson, Van Til, and Dr. Lau likes to emphasize, is once we become epistemically self-conscious, now we have to deal with that situation. And the only way to deal with that, to be consistent, is God's revelation. Hence, revelational epistemology. So. Yeah,
and it's interesting that you bring up the secular philosophy part, because this is one of those things where I just didn't feel like I had time to address it. But it was, the debate was going in 6 different directions. Where Jacob made the point, and I think his closing statement, he said something about how, we borrow from secular philosophies like Hume and Kant, and why are you mixing Christian theology with them? And well, first of all, he explicitly does the same thing. He's a big fan of Ayn Rand, and I think he actually gets the new Christian intellectual. I think that's actually from that term is from Ayn Rand, the new intellectual. So it's like, well, first of all, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you do it. But if you're going to say it as a criticism, well, we're not saying we use Hume to prove God's existence, or we use to prove God's existence. What they did was critique bad arguments for God's existence. And that was part of the point I tried to make in my opening statement, that it's possible to reason poorly for God's existence. In 1 Peter, it says that we're to sanctify Christ as Lord in our heart, and then give a hope for the defense that is in us. So which means it's possible, Paul tells the Colossian church to, he says, do philosophy not according to the principles of this world, which means it's possible to do that. So
Right.
don't do it.
Exactly.
Because Paul says that the word he used is you'll be mugged. It's like what Proverbs says about answering the fool according to his folly, because you'll be like him. If you use his categories and try to use his standards, it's going to work as well as it does for him, which is not at all. So you can't Vantel always talked about taking on their position for the sake of argument. We're not taking on their position to try to prove our position. We're trying to take on their position to disprove theirs.
Right. Exactly. And use it
And
against
that's
them.
it. Yeah, and that's something I didn't have time to go into really, but it's again one of those mischaracterizations because
and that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this,
Yeah.
so we can flesh these things out even more.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember. I read a book on I think it was 5 views on philosophy a while ago. I'm trying to remember which atheist philosopher it was. I think it was I think it was a Christian philosopher who he made the same mistake. He was like, well, Hume was wrong. Well, sure, Hume was wrong, but his criticisms of the theistic arguments were correct. So it's, again, we're not trying to mix secular and Christian categories, but we're using them to show that sometimes Christians do things poorly, and it's just another opportunity for us to regiment our own beliefs.
And that sometimes these people say true things.
Yeah.
And if it's true, it belongs to God.
Mm-hmm.
It belongs to God anyways. So we're redeeming it back for the Lord. For Jesus Christ, who is the key holder of knowledge and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
If they have any type of wisdom or truth, it's because of God's providence, them giving the ability to have any truth at all. And that's what we're telling them. Hey, that belongs to God. Give them back, and now you account for being able to do this. We can, you can't. No other view can, by the way, only the Christian worldview.
Yeah, it's just another for us to plunder the Egyptians, basically.
Right. So, can you flesh out real quick what he meant by, some people, because they were asking me, and I was doing my best to explain, but because you seem to go back and forth with him on this whole inferential point he kept talking about.
Yeah, that's one of the details of presuppositionalism that, Vantel wasn't the final word on apologetics, and there was genuine work to be done to kind of flesh the system out. And that's one of the things that Brunton talked about in his PhD dissertation, where he talks about how, I think he mentions this in his PhD dissertation when he discusses self-deception, where not all knowledge is inferential. Really recognizing God's existence in creation really is, in a sense, recognizing a person. You may not, it's not a syllogism, you don't do deduction on it, but that means you can have justified knowledge without inferring it. It's not a matter of, you always, you go through premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and then a conclusion. And unfortunately, it may be one of those things where I just have to read more on it. I listened to a couple of Brunton's lectures where he explained it. I read his PhD dissertation. I honestly don't have much else to say other than, and I'm not sure Brunton ever talked about it too much either, but he meant, most of the time it seems like he mentions it in passing, but basically it just makes the point that you can have knowledge that is not, that is immediate in a sense. It's, you either know it or you don't know it. It's not necessarily a conscious recognition, but that doesn't make it not knowledge.
Right. And so, which then he concluded that the knowledge of God was not innate. right? So it's like there is no innate knowledge of God. Did I get him wrong, or did I understand him correctly?
No, that's what he said. I again, it's one of those things where I really would have liked to have been able to chase him down a little bit more and show him wrong.
Which even there, that's a disconnect with Christian, philosophy, Christian theology, and Reformed Christian philosophy, that we understand, and we've insisted in all the Reformed systematics, is that God's knowledge is, the whole Calvinist, not necessarily Calvinist, but Calvin's view, the Reformed view of the sensus divinitas. And
yeah, it did seem like he was just kind of, I think even Sproul would disagree with him.
Yeah, I learned it from Sproul myself.
Yeah,
so,
I think they even talk about inherent knowledge in classical apologetics.
Yeah.
That they say that we have it. So I'm not for sure. I'm just going on memory. I think they do talk about it, but
most of the guys,
it's like a very common concept.
I won't say most. Every guy that classical Reform guy that I've dealt with, all affirm, the innate knowledge of God. I mean, there might be some, it's immediate. I'm the guy that believes it's immediate and immediate. It's inward, being created in the image of God. We have that sense of the divine because we are made in God's image, and like I said, we have that knowledge of God. It's inescapable, and we can also, see God's creation and behold His glory and His majesty. God exists. So I found that, like, what? This man just said that he does not agree, or he tried to make it like, oh, there's a whole bunch of different interpretations of that. No, there really isn't. That's not even true. That's not true.
I'm not sure I've ever heard of Reformed theology.
Right.
We don't have innate knowledge of God. That part was really odd to me.
Right. I mean, there is outside of the Reformed camp, but there's a general consensus. That's a basic Reformed orthodoxy, is, the whole sensus divinitas, the sense of the divine, which we believe that Revelational Epistemology, Presuppositional apologetics is a consistent flow conclusion of that concept of Calvin and Reformed theology in general, which they don't like to hear. This is new. No, it's a consistent.
No, not really.
It's a consistent, or
it's been around a couple centuries.
Yeah. So we got that about the inferential thing. I found that really odd that he rejected the sensus divinitas, and I'm mad at Marlon for saying sensus divinitatis. I'm gonna get you on that, bro. So you're making it sound like some kind of malaria disease.
Sounds like
I was just cracking up.
Oh man, I got the sensus divinitis.
I got the divinitis, man. He's gonna kill me. He'll be all right. So the other thing was, again, the extra circular. I think we dealt with that already. What are you even talking about? That's again.
No, I listened through the cross exam once more, and no, I think we pretty much covered everything that I thought.
Right.
Reading through it a second time, there were some parts that I thought I got better, other parts that I didn't think I did as well on, and
And ontology, epistemology, I think he butchered the mess out of that too.
Yeah.
And I think we took care of that, the whole proximate, ultimate justification for that. Now, ontologically, obviously God, his being, he created all things. But like I've always said in my videos and in discussions with the guys in the group, is obviously you have to know something about God in order to place him in these categories, which is epistemology. How do you know what we know about God? Well, God's revelation, both general and special revelation. That's what revelational epistemology is. They think that when we say revelational epistemology, we're just talking about the Bible. The emphasis is the Bible, God's revelation, his verbal revelation, but we're also including general revelation. It's inescapable. That's our point. That general revelation is inescapable, and special revelation furthers the point. It interprets, general revelation correctly.
Yeah, that was one of the parts of the debates where I was like, he's just kind of, it sounds like he's just kind of insisting that he's right, because I kept trying to tell him, no, we're making an epistemological point. You have to believe in God in your belief system to justify anything. And he kept saying, well, no, that's ontological. It's like, no, it's a belief. It's part of your belief system. So right. I didn't know of any other way to really.
It's a knowledge claim.
Yeah.
That's epistemology, sir. Okay, how do you know what you know? How do you know God is ontologically necessary? Things like that, like Bonson, or if you're gonna put apples into a sorter, you got to know something about the apples to sort them out.
Yeah, I remember that analogy.
Stuff, it's like, so it's intermingled. Yeah, they're distinct, but they're connected. But yeah, man. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that pretty much covers it, man.
Okay, cool, man. So, one last thing. Here, let me read this. Well, I think we already took that, the whole thing about judging between circular worldviews.
Oh, yeah.
We've already discussed the whole vicious circularity, virtuous circularity. God is the beginning and end. And to be honest, I think we could do a better job of explaining that, where we don't necessarily believe in a vicious circle type, but more of what Van Til called a spiral circle. It's a straight line, but that straight line, it's a spiral because everything relates to each other. Everything relates back to God. So it spirals back. We continue with knowledge and truth, but all that goes back to God. So it's a spiral circle. Maybe we could say a spiral line. Yeah.
Like yeah, it just goes back to, one of the things that I think this debate shows is we just need to keep doing our homework. They're just, people have reasonable questions, and even if unreasonable people can have reasonable questions.
Yep.
And it just goes back to, we have the biblical apologetic, we need to propagate it, but we also need to study it more and more ourselves. Otherwise, other people will just say that we're asserting that we're true as opposed to proving that we're true.
Right. Well, Seth, man, I appreciate you coming on today, man, to just quickly flesh out some of the stuff. I think we cleared up some other things, and
yeah, man.
I know you're gonna take a break from. I appreciate take a break from debating, or.
Well, I don't have any upcoming yet, so I don't want to overstep him with Marlon. So.
Yeah, Marlon doing his thing, man. But yeah, thank you for being here, man. I see you in the group, brother, and I think we've answered pretty much a lot of their questions. I was reading through them. I was like, you know what? We actually dealt with all that stuff. There's no need to rehash them again. But thank you for being here, man. Hope you're well. Everybody's your family. Everybody's well. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Don't get that Rona.
Yeah, Rona.
All right, brother.
Cool. Thanks.
God bless.
Have a good one.
And with that, guys, I just wanted to mention that there will be some more podcasts coming on systematic theology in an urban context, how we can apply that. It applies to all of context of life, obviously. But this is the Urban Reform Podcast, and just wanted to do more Reformed theology. Go start from the basics into, starting with scripture and going on from there, general revelation, special revelation, and just systematically start touching on all the doctrines within Reformed orthodoxy. In a simple way, again, like I've said before, if you're looking for some heavy, detailed, highly intellectual, not that we can't be intellectual, but I'm saying I want to bring Reformed theology and its truth to the level that we can all understand it basically, and it's up to you to continue to study them and have a deeper knowledge of Reformed theology and other aspects and branches that come with it, that all the deeper things that are out there. Not that we won't talk about them, because we will, but grab your systematic theologies, read them, study them. Don't just rely on the internet and Facebook groups and stuff like that. But with that said, I have some more guests coming in the next few weeks. Stay tuned for that. If you haven't already, subscribe, like, share. And with that, I want to see you. Peace.